The Silvery Barbs spell just came out in Strixhaven Curriculum of Chaos, and it is getting a lot of attention. Hey Optimancers, Chris here. I want to talk today about whether Silvery Barbs should be banned. This is a first level spell using a reaction. It is available to bards, sorcerers, and wizards. Of course, there are other ways to access this spell as well. As I said, this is a reaction casting, and that's triggered when a creature you can see within 60 feet succeeds on an attack roll, an ability check, or a saving throw. Then you can choose to cast Silvery Barbs, and you make them roll a d20, and they have to use the new roll if it's lower. Otherwise, they stick with their initial roll. Then we choose a second creature, and that creature then gets advantage on their next attack roll, ability check, or saving throw that they make within the next minute. And they can only be empowered by one use of this spell at a time, though I don't really see how that makes a difference, considering it's automatically on the next saving throw, attack roll, or ability check, and multiple instances of advantage don't stack. Now, there is a very common opinion that this spell should be banned without ever seeing play. We're seeing what personally I consider hyperbole all over the place now. There's this kind of mob mentality that this spell is something to be afraid of, and something that must be banned before you ever use it. So there's this thing where people are looking for examples of it where it breaks the game and coming up with some pretty weak examples, I think.
At 10th level, when you cast an enchantment spell of first level or higher that targets only one creature, you can have it target a second creature. Now that gets a little tricky because in theory you target two creatures with Silvery Barbs. You target the initial creature that takes the negative effect, and then you target the creature that takes the positive effect. I don't know, that might have been part of the design, but if not, you could in theory use split enchantment from level 10 of the enchantment wizard to cast Silvery Barbs and target two creatures.
So yeah, there's no in theory this spell has two targets. It has two targets. That's not theory, that's just black and white on the page. The example here just clearly doesn't work. I recently did a video on the interaction with legendary resistance. And again, I think, why is this being brought up in the first place? Why do we suddenly think that this is the reroll that invalidates the ability of legendary resistance to ignore the roll in the first place? And we've seen a sage advice on this now, clarifying, yes, legendary resistance means you make the save regardless of the roll. Now, why did the designers need to tell us that legendary resistance actually works the way it's written? Why do I need to mention that having two targets isn't the same as having one target and doesn't qualify you for features that require only one target? Well, we can never be certain about the intention of other people. I kind of suspect what might be happening here is we've got a bit of a bandwagon effect where there's this call for this spell to be banned, and it just kind of gathers just like a snowball rolling, and it gets more and more people on board. And once you're of the opinion it needs to be banned, then you're going to look for examples that support your preconception. So if I think that this spell breaks the game, then I'm going to look for places where it breaks the game. And sometimes I'm going to find things that aren't necessarily fully supported in the rules, but if I think there's any doubt, then I'm going to bring them up anyway. And I think we're getting some of that. This actually seems like a familiar reaction to me, because I remember this. When we had the Healing Spirit spell, when it was first released in Xanathar's Guide to Everything, something very similar happened. Many players suggesting the spell should never see play as written, it was going to break the game, and they called for the designers to redesign it. And what followed was a couple years of a lot of tables banning it without ever using it once. And then there were other tables, including mine, that used it, and it was a good spell, but it never broke games. And eventually then the designers relented and redesigned the spell, and now nobody gets to use it. Because that's what happens, of course. If you have players that ban the spell on day one, they weren't using it anyway, but other people were using it and it was working fine for them, but we'll take it away from them as well. So I wonder if Silvery Barbs is going to have a similar fate, because there's a lot of calls for redesign and a lot of calls for a day one ban. And they seem just as loud as they did with Healing Spirit, and with Healing Spirit, they got their way. I've looked at various explanations for the reaction to this spell, and here are some reasons given why this spell should never be allowed in actual games, and I'm actually using direct quotes here. It invalidates limited class features like heightened spell because it can be pulled out every time an enemy roll doesn't go the player's way. It being applied to saving throws is too powerful. Now spellcasters don't have to worry about enemy saves. Low-level casters become degraded to Silvery Barbs throwers. Every first level spell slot for the entire campaign is going to be spent on the same spell. It is the most powerful spell in the game. The providing advantage on top of the reroll is too strong. Silvery Barbs is straight out better than Shield. Rerolls are boring, so now you're using your spell slots for something that makes the game more boring. Silvery Barbs can be stacked with other sources of disadvantage or other reroll mechanics like Lucky. An 18th level wizard can choose this with spell mastery and cast it for free. It's setting specific, and I ban setting specific stuff unless we're playing in that setting. So, one thing I should mention is the last reason listed is a good reason. That one, I'm not even sure I'd call that a ban. I mean, if you are playing in a specific setting and there's setting material for different settings, I think the base assumption should be that's not available unless the DM is adapting it or integrating it into your setting. So I don't even consider that a ban. But these other reasons, I think a lot of them are pretty easy to debunk. So let's just address some of the easy stuff right away. First, reactions aren't free. They aren't free now. They were never free. You use a reaction, you don't get another one until your next turn. First level spells are finite, and they were already stretched before this spell was introduced to your game. This isn't an introduction to first level spells being useful. They were already useful. Spellcasters were already using them all the time, including on reactions. In fact, probably primarily on reactions once we get into higher level play. If you're actually concerned about what spells might break the game with an 18th level wizard, this is a weird spell to single out. And a spellcaster who only casts Silvery Barbs is actually going to be pretty weak. I think those things should be reasonably obvious if we do stop and actually consider them. But I do want to narrow in on some of the objections to this spell that I think merit some further analysis. So let's talk about rerolls being boring. Granting advantage on top of the reroll is too strong. The use against saving throws is too powerful. And this invalidating other spells and class features, and the shield spell is often called out here. And remember, these aren't just complaints against this spell. These are reasons you should ban this spell. So let's go through those objections. So, are rerolls boring? Well, obviously that's subjective. I'm on record that Halfling Luck is my favorite racial feature in the game. And that's a reroll mechanic, so obviously I don't think rerolls are boring. But I'll grant that different players are welcome to have different opinions on that. But I'll tell you what, I would find it alarming if I went to play a halfling in someone's campaign and they said they're not going to allow them because they ban reroll mechanics because they personally don't find them interesting and they don't really care if I do or not, or they assume that everyone must have the same opinion they do. Honestly, at that point, I might just move on because that's a pretty big red flag right there. I think the concern here might be, though, that it's not that there's a feature that's boring, because there's already several reroll mechanics in the game, and if you find those boring, they already exist. I think the concern may be that this particular reroll mechanic is going to be so pervasive, it's going to take over the game. So we will be talking about that. I don't think it will. But let's discuss the second objection. Granting advantage on top of a reroll is too strong. Listen, if you think a reroll itself is too strong for a first level spell, then I get that. I think this is a strong spell. And the difference between strong and too strong is sometimes a narrow line. So if somebody says rerolling is too strong, you know, I'm not on board, but I can certainly empathize. But the advantage here? It's really no big deal. This is a minor aspect of the spell. Now, if you could hold that advantage and then use it when you need it, like an inspiration point or most of the mechanics which provide advantage, then it would be a lot more powerful. But since you have to use it on your next roll, and you may not even have any control of what that roll is or what the stakes are for that roll, well, I think that makes this a lot more minor. I mean, advantage and disadvantage are fairly common on rolls, so it's not even unlikely that this is literally going to do nothing. I mean, if I'm forced to make a concentration save, for example, and I already had advantage on the save, I don't get to choose to save my Silvery Barbs advantage, I just lose it. Timing this so the advantage is going to be applied to an important roll is going to be a measure in futility, because the trigger for this spell is not related to this portion of the spell. Now, I agree the advantage on top of the reroll probably wasn't needed, because this spell was already really good without it. But I don't see the advantage as being the part of this spell where we're suddenly breaking games. Advantage is super common. There's countless things that provide advantage already in this game. I'm not going to even attempt to list them all. This is one more, and there's very little control over when it's used, and I just don't see any way this is going to be game breaking. It's a footnote in the overall power of this spell. Now let's talk about being used against saving throws being too powerful. Specifically, I saw a comment that this basically replaces heightened spell meta magic with a first level spell. Is that the case? No, it's not. Just to remind you, the heightened spell meta magic is a sorcerer option to impose disadvantage on a saving throw against the spell they cast for the cost of 3 sorcery points. Now, a couple things I should mention is using heightened spell doesn't mean you can't cast Silvery Barbs on top of that if the creature succeeds in the first place. With Silvery Barbs, you get to know the result before you apply it. So heightened spell, you're doing it before you cast a spell. Well, with Silvery Barbs, we're waiting until we have a successful save before we cast it, and that is definitely an advantage. But does it actually replace heightened spell? So if you're fighting the red dragon and you wanted to disintegrate it, you might add heightened spell to give it disadvantage on its saving throw. So instead of around a 50% chance of succeeding on the save, it's actually closer to about 25%. Now, one problem that comes up with heightened spell is it doesn't stop legendary resistance. So if this is a significant dragon, it's going to make the saving throw regardless. That's actually one of the big disadvantages of heightened spell. But let's say it doesn't have legendary resistance, or maybe it's used them up. Well, then the disadvantage is going to give us a much better chance of success. So here's the claim. We don't need heightened spell because Silvery Barbs exists and it basically does the same thing. So the dragon makes their saving throw and you apply Silvery Barbs to force a reroll. So that is essentially the same as just having disadvantage on the roll in the first place. Except, assuming you don't destroy the dragon, now it's going to attack you. And on its turn, maybe it breathes on you, or maybe it does its multi-attack combination, plus some legendary attacks on top of that. Well, if we cast Silvery Barbs, then we're going to take the full brunt of that. We used up our reaction. If we had used Heightened Spell instead, we could cast Absorb Elements against the Dragon's Breath, or Shield against the multi-attack combination, but by casting Silvery Barbs, we pay an opportunity cost by using our reaction, because reactions aren't free. I see this same attitude come up with bonus actions too. Reactions, bonus actions, by all means use them, but don't think they're free. When you use them for one thing, you're giving up the other things you might have done with them. I should add that if the creature who made this saving throw was likely to succeed on that saving throw to begin with, then they're likely going to succeed again. And then you spend a first level spell slot and give up your reaction, and you get nothing. Now, is effective disadvantage forced on a saving throw going to be game breaking? Because this is the claim. Not that this spell is powerful. We all agree this is a good spell. The claim is this spell needs banning. So, does effective disadvantage forced on a saving throw break games? Well, we should already know the answer. Because if Heightened Spell broke your game, then yeah, Silvery Barbs might break your game in similar fashion, and you have reason for concern. That hasn't been my experience. I expect using Silvery Barbs this way is going to be very useful. But we're not guaranteeing a failed saving throw. We're taking a saving throw that might have succeeded or it might have failed and making it less likely to succeed and more likely to fail. But if an unlucky roll by the creature in the first place didn't break your game, then adjusting the odds isn't really breaking your game either. Now, if you want to say that Silvery Barbs works as a replacement for Chronal Shift, the second level Chronergy Wizard feature, well, now I think you got a decent case. But you know what? I'll shed tears for the poor Chronergist Wizard later, because we have more topics to discuss. Namely, Silvery Barbs replaces or invalidates the shield spell. Silvery Barbs could make shield obsolete. Silvery Barbs can negate a critical hit, and shield can't. Okay, so before we get into the math here, I want to be clear, I'm fully on board the Silvery Barbs is more versatile than shield train. There's simply no question that shield is a less versatile spell than Silvery Barbs. Does that mean Silvery Barbs is going to make shield obsolete? On its own, absolutely not. Silent Image is more versatile than shield too, yet strangely casters still take shield. The actual message here is that Silvery Barbs isn't just more versatile than shield, it's that it's more versatile than shield on top of being as good as shield as a defensive spell. That's the real message you're being given. So is that true? We have multiple comparisons to how Silvery Barbs is basically around a -5 to a roll, and shield provides a +5 to armor class, so they're basically about the same, except Silvery Barbs grants advantage to an ally on top of that. So in 99.9% of cases, Silvery Barbs is the better spell. Now, in case you think I'm not accurately conveying the comparison.
Now, I don't want to make the sweeping statement that Silvery Barbs is better than shield in absolutely every situation, because no matter what, I get a YouTube comment that brings up one specific niche instance in which, whatever, but in 99.9% of situations in D&D, you are essentially a worse character for taking shield instead of Silvery Barbs.
Okay, now obviously there's no way I can cover every combat situation your character might be in, or most of them, or even a significant portion of them. We can, however, cover some norms. Normally, you're fighting more than one creature. Normally, creatures make attacks. Normally, creatures with the exception of low challenge ratings have the multi-attack feature. Normally, creatures as we move into moderate challenge ratings have additional features beyond straight attacks. Normally, attacks are not spread evenly between party members. As I mentioned, I can't cover even a significant portion of examples of combat, but here's one combat I would not consider atypical. So we have a 5th level party, and they're facing some red slots. Officially speaking, this is actually a deadly encounter, but the challenge rating system, I mean, it doesn't really work. That's an entirely different video, but I think most of us are aware of that already. Generally, I'd expect any reasonably optimized group to win this combat fairly handily, though they're probably going to have to expend some resources to do so. Our Eldritch Knight, however, has found themselves in melee. Perhaps intentionally, perhaps they just got caught. Either way, our Eldritch Knight sports plate and shield, and has Silvery Barbs and shield as available defensive spells. So the initiative count of the red slots comes up, and they attack the Eldritch Knight. So a quick review of the red slot. Well, we've got multi-attack, 3 attacks, 1 with its bite, 2 with its claws. All those attacks are a +6 to hit. With the claw, they have to succeed on a DC 14 Constitution saving throw, or they're infected with a disease, a minuscule slot egg that can be removed with a cure disease spell or 5 points of a paladin's lay on hands. So our first attack against our fighter occurs, and we're going to assume maybe the slot tried to bite our fighter, and the DM now announces that the attack is hit. So that's our scenario. And let's assume in our scenario we're playing rules as written. And if we do that, the player of the fighter doesn't know what the DM rolled. The DM just says it hits, and that's all we know. We don't know how much it hit by, and we don't know whether it's a critical hit. A lot of tables don't play this way. I personally don't play this way, but this is a bit of a disadvantage to the shield spell if it is played this way, because normally if we're playing and we know the results, we know if shield works. In this case, we actually don't. So in this situation, what does the fighter cast? Does this count as one of the 99.9% of situations where Silvery Barbs is better than Shield? Honestly, Shield is given a bit of a disadvantage here by not knowing what the DM rolled, but let's give Silvery Barbs the advantage that this DM doesn't announce the roll. So let's assume the fighter casts Silvery Barbs. Well, first, the slot must re-roll the attack. This attack now has a 65% chance of missing. Regardless of whether it hits or misses, the fighter now has advantage they can give to themselves or another ally on their next check. Let's say they give themselves advantage. After all, they plan to attack these slots on their next turn. An advantage would be nice to have. So how effective was the Silvery Barbs spell here? Well, the average damage of the slot bite is 8 points. And we know the slot must have rolled between a 14 and a 20 on that d20 in order to hit in the first place. So there was a 1 in 7 chance that initial roll was a critical hit. So actually, the average damage is closer to 9. By using Silvery Barbs, we've reduced the average damage on that attack to 3, because providing 2 chances in 3 that it will miss instead. So we just saved ourselves 6 points of damage. But we're not done, as the spell has given us advantage on top of that. So now we get attacked 8 more times. We can't use Silvery Barbs again because we've expended our reaction, and reactions aren't free. Average damage on those 8 attacks is about 38 points. We also expect to be hit by 2 claws. Each of those claws require a DC 14 saving throw to avoid being infected with a slod tadpole. This actually isn't that big a deal, as I mentioned, but we will be making one of those saves with advantage, because according to the Silvery Barbs spell, the advantage provided must be used on the next ability check, saving throw, or attack roll. So we have no choice, we have to use it. So here's what Silvery Barbs did for us. We reduced damage taken from 47 points on average to 41, and our chance of infection now, instead of being 2 saving throws, is 1 saving throw with advantage and 1 straight up. So Silvery Barbs absolutely had an effect here. What if we had cast Shield instead? Well, if that attack roll had been in 19 or 20, then Shield doesn't work and we're going to take full damage anyways. If the roll was anywhere between 14 and 18, the attack now misses. So we take the guaranteed hit and reduce the chance to hit to 29%. On average, we're avoiding 6 points of damage, just like Silvery Barbs did for us. Then, 8 more attacks occur. We reduce all of their chances to hit from 35% to 10%. The expected 38 points of damage from those attacks is reduced to 11 points. And what about those saving throws? Well, we know what's going to happen here, because now likely only 1 claw is going to hit with these reduced chances to hit. So instead of making 1 saving throw with advantage and another one without advantage, now we only have to make 1 saving throw. So even our chance of infection is lower than if we had cast Silvery Barbs. This was more effective than the advantage that Silvery Barbs gave. So Shield reduced 5 times more damage and actually reduced our chance of infection too. There's literally no upside in this case to casting Silvery Barbs. And what if the initial attack roll was a critical? Let's confirm that it was a critical. The DM announces it crits. You know what? Shield is still the better spell, because although the initial damage isn't reduced, it still reduces our expected damage by 33 on the follow-up attacks, while Silvery Barbs reduces our total damage by about 10, less than a third as effective, plus the greater chance of infection. Now, I'm not saying this covers 100% of situations. Maybe the fighter was only facing 1 attack, and that attack could be a critical hit and might have done a ton of damage. Then yeah, Silvery Barbs is probably gonna work, and Shield definitely won't. There's situations where Silvery Barbs is going to work better than the Shield spell. No one is saying the Shield spell obsolete Silvery Barbs. What people are saying is that Silvery Barbs obsoletes Shield. If that's the case, then Silvery Barbs needs to be better than Shield in 99 or 99.9% of situations. But don't tell me that's the case, or even that it's usually going to be better than Shield in cases where Shield could be useful. Attacks come in groups, and if that aspect of the Shield spell, that it works against all attacks, wasn't always a big deal, not just suddenly today, then we would have seen a lot less shields and we would have seen a lot more defensive duelists. This didn't suddenly become irrelevant or a small thing because we want to make some sweeping statements about a spell we've never used, seen used, but really want to get people to be scared of. So let's get into our big final complaint. Spellcasters are just going to cast this over and over and over. Well, I think we've demonstrated that the shield spell still has its place in a post-Silvery Barbs world, as does heightened spell. It should be obvious that absorb elements does too, since it's used in situations where Silvery Barbs is generally going to be of no or little help. So let's just think about it. We're playing a 10th level wizard. We have absorb elements. We have shield. We have Silvery Barbs. We have counterspell. We have 4 first level slots, 3 second level slots, 3 third level slots, 3 fourth level slots, and 2 fifth level slots. So let's say we have an encounter and we cast a spell and the enemy makes their saving throw. We don't think they have legendary resistance, and maybe they had a 50% chance to make the saving throw. How good is Silvery Barbs? Well, it has about a 50% chance of working, so let's start with that. Pretty good. Now, if we're attacked later that round, we have no shield spell. If area of effect energy damage occurs later that round, we have no absorb elements. And this is maybe the most important thing of all when we get into higher level play. If an enemy spellcaster casts a spell, we have no counterspell. Any of these things could cause us to break concentration on the spell we used Silvery Barbs for in the first place. So maybe casting Silvery Barbs was the right move, and maybe not. It's going to depend. And I think players are going to learn relatively quickly that sometimes Silvery Barbs is a bad use of a first level slot and a reaction, even though the trigger took place. Then what happens when we run out of first level slots? Because I'm hearing all about action economy. We can just cast this spell so often because it's triggered so easily. And yeah, that's true. Well, I guess we could go into second level slots. So we're going to give up the web spell for a single reroll and an inflexible advantage roll. That, to me, seems like a horrible trade. Never mind, now our shields and absorb elements are sneaking into those higher level slots too. And then there's only 3 second level slots. Then suddenly we're into third level slots. The trade-offs get even worse. So I see 2 problems with the assumption that spellcasters are just going to spam this. The first, reactions aren't free. When we use our reaction, we give up the other things we might need to use that reaction for, maybe even really important things. The second is that first level spell slots aren't free either, and spellcasters already burn those like crazy, including Silvery Barbs. Even once players realize there's a right and wrong time to cast it, automatically means less shields, less absorbing elements, and less counterspell availability. There's just no way around that. But this is all just analysis. What about what's going to happen in actual gameplay? Well, here's the thing. Any DM who says they're banning this without ever seeing it in action is speaking with 0 experience. They're only using their guesses on how it's going to affect gameplay. It's not like they've actually had the experience of seeing this spell break anything. Now, I've had the opportunity to see Silvery Barbs in action several times already. And you know what? It's a good spell. But so far, I haven't seen it break anything. Sometimes players cast it and they regret it later when they needed their reaction for something else. Sometimes they use it and it does nothing. And sometimes they use it and it works really well. Now, maybe with more and more experience, I'll find cases where it really does break the game. Should that happen, well then I think I'll adjust my opinions accordingly. In the meantime, I think Silvery Barbs is a good spell, but I don't think it's uniquely good. I don't think it's game-breaking, and I think maybe we should calm down and see how it impacts actual play before we start jumping to wild conclusions or reaching for dubious rules interactions to support our gut reactions. Yes, it does make characters more powerful to have access to yet another powerful spell in D&D. This has happened before. It's called power creep, and frankly, either a new option for player characters isn't good, or it makes characters more powerful. This is hardly a unique example, and in my opinion, not even the most dramatic example we've seen with power creep in this game. Or at least, that's my take. What's yours? Let me know in the comments down below. Otherwise, until next time, I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks everybody, and I'll talk to you soon.